Giles Brown.
Let's talk.
We have Houston, we have connection, or Valhalla, we have connection. Norse fighting heroes, kings, conquerors, and shieldmaidens. All about Vikings. One of history's best known archetypes. But are they stereotypes? Are they just all hardy warriors? What were the reasons behind the Vikings' fearsome reputations? I just say the man behind the book Norse Fighting Heroes. Jamie Ryder joins me live on the line, probably from a longboat by a fjord somewhere. Jamie, how are you?
I am great, Giles. I mean, I wish it was on a long boat somewhere in the fjords, but I'm only coming to you from rainy Manchester at this time, I'm afraid, mate.
Listen, if you close your eyes, the ship canal can be kind of the same. It's not a problem at all. So tell me a little bit about where this book started, because everybody thinks they know the Vikings. They've seen the TV series. They may have played Assassin's Creed or something like that. What's your starting point for Norse Fighting Heroes?
Yeah, so in terms of the actual way this book came about, I've always been fascinated by Viking history, and that actually leads into my general thoughts on different kinds of history. I really like Japanese history, for example, as well. My first book in this series was called Japanese Fighting Heroes, where I dived into this romanticized image of like the samurai and warriors, and I think that's a great portion of history, but in things like the Japanese fighting heroes landscape and with Norse fighting heroes, I really wanted to dive into the actual historical facts behind the romance as well. I mean, you mentioned that there's the Viking TV series, for example. Now, I love that show, and that has been a big inspiration for writing the book, but that's only one aspect of it with pop culture, and that's a lot of what we get looked at in the modern day media, I think, whereas I think the Vikings as a whole, the people, they were far more complex in terms of the myths, the way they lived their lives, and it's in terms of looking at like saga analysis and the archaeological point of view as well, and that's 2 points that I put into the book in terms of where the historical fact comes from and blending it with these larger than life figures like Harald Hardrada, Ragnar Lothbrok, for example, two very famous Viking figures that maybe a lot of people might know about, but also lesser known figures like a woman called Ode the Deep-Minded, who made this really death-defying journey from miles away from going to a new part of the world to protect her family, and it's trying to distill these really intrinsic traditional lessons that I think we can all learn from day to day, but also trying to apply it to the modern era at the same time.
What's interesting is because your first book's about samurai, which is a fighting culture that's been romanticized because you think about shogun and all that sort of stuff, but you don't think about Bushido and the way of the warrior and all that sort of that. And this is, if you like, again, there is a structure, there's a hierarchy in Viking. It's not all berserkers with axes and just, flinging yourself. As you mentioned, the saga there, this is written down. There is a link between saga and Norse mythology, as there is a link between sort of Japanese storytelling and that romanticized figure of the Ronin, of the samurai, of Bushido.
Indeed, and I think what I like anyway is the fact that a lot of these different cultures, there are very similar philosophical techniques, like trying to look at how we can brave death or look at life in different ways. And with the samurai and the Vikings, for example, I find those two warrior classes to be fascinating on their own, but they weren't just that. You had the berserkers, yes, you had the samurai, but they had a lot of mental health techniques. They dived into philosophy, the sagas, the ruins, all of these other holistic techniques that they might have brought into the way they lived their lives. And I think there's a lot of what we can learn day to day from these very simple things that they took up, but also things that maybe not necessarily are always applicable to what we do, but you can always learn about how not to live your life from these figures too. And I find that dichotomy to be fascinating at the same time.
As well as that, of course, the Vikings, it's not any sort of, sacking Lindisfarne and, raping and pillaging. If you think about where we are at the time, they are, if you like, space travelers. They are taking their longboats and they are exploring and they are going to the edge of the world, and there be monsters, incredibly brave, and they're real, in modern parts, they're pushing the envelope, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think it's important to look at the sagas as a whole and the fact that these stories are amazing. Like one of my favourite sagas is the Volsung saga, which goes through many different generations of Vikings, and it's all about fate and trying to resist your fate, but all actually succumbing to it in the end. And I think there's a lot of interesting lessons about ambition, but also that was not historical fact at the same time. I love the idea of these people coming together that they might have actually written about or lived a similar life, but there wasn't like any particular ways that they could have written down these stories. It was all through oral tradition, and this saga actually came a couple of hundred years later after the Viking era ended, where these people were looking back at their ancestors probably through rose-tinted lenses and trying to apply stories that had been taken from perhaps somewhere like Norway. They would have transmuted them over to Iceland as a way to look back at the past, but also as a way to look to the future too.
Here's the thing. I mean, when we talk about Vikings, are we talking about an empire, a kingdom with one particular, and are we talking about, because when you say Vikings, people think Sweden, Norway, Danelaw or whatever. I mean, are we talking that region and Iceland? Is there one particular king? Is it a variety of kings and tribes? Are we sort of, is it too easy to sort of make a distinction, or just say a group of Vikings and we just think, guys with horns on their heads, which they never had, obviously, but, that sort of stereotypical image?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the best ways to look at it is obviously the Vikings were not an ethnic group. They were a diverse cast of nations and characters and tribes who were all vying for control across various points of history. What I really find interesting is that a lot of what we know about Vikings is very much done in like the Anglo-centric point of view, and the fact that traditionally the Vikings showed up in Lindisfarne, they raided that abbey, and then it went all the way to Harald Hardrada with the Battle of Hastings in 1660 AD, and you assume that's the end of the Viking age, but that actually isn't the case. The Vikings were migrating back and forth across different points of history. You've got a lot of the Eastern mythology of Vikings with the Rus as well, and how the founding of Russia could have potentially come about. I think a lot of that gets pushed under the rug sometimes, which is equally fascinating. You've got the Varangian Guard with the Byzantines, who were like an elite fighting force of Vikings who were very similar to the Praetorian Guard, maybe a couple of 100 years ago with the Romans as well. So they fulfilled that similar point of view. But in terms of like interesting kings as well, a few of them in the book, for example, you've got Canute the Great, who I think is a fascinating character as well, in the fact that I look at him as like the Norse Alexander the Great in many ways, because he went through many battles where he was undefeated in a lot of what he did, but also he knew how to adapt and to he still had that Norse mentality, but he was very much an English king when he was at the height of his power. He knew how to push back Viking attacks from Norway and Sweden, but also work with them at the same time. So you see this gradual shedding of this Viking raider mentality as these Norsemen actually come into England and other countries and assimilate to that culture, but also add their own parts of their own indigenous culture to it as well.
Yeah, there's one called, I can't remember his first name, but it's Jerusalem's son, and he goes all the way from I think it's Sweden. He stops off in Portugal because it's this time of the Al-Andalus. He has a quick bit of combat there, and then he ends up in Jerusalem, for goodness sake, with the Crusaders, and you think, good grief, these guys got around a bit.
Indeed, and that actually might be, I'm not entirely sure about this, but that might be Sigurd the Crusader as well. He was fascinating.
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, he was the only Norseman who actually made like a holy crusade in his own right, and that is a fascinating journey as well.
It's not just the guys, though. I mean, it's called, it's kings, conquerors, and shield maidens. So the role, and good morning to my Swedish female friends, because you'll be nodding along in this time, but, the role of women in Viking culture and Scandinavian culture is very important as well.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, the shieldmaidens is obviously the most well-known sort of pop culture-led approach, where you assume, women were always fighting with the men as well, and there's a lot of debate around that, and I think to an extent that is certainly true. The best archaeological evidence that I think has come out for now is there is a skeleton that was found in Birka, where they actually did some chromosome research on it, and they did find that it was a female warrior who was buried with honours. So that really is a fascinating point of view of how you could actually look at women fighting in the Viking Age. But in other aspects, there is other versions of that as well, because I did mention Ode the Deep-Minded as well, who I've written about in the book. And she's an interesting character in the fact that she wasn't really a shield maiden. She was just somebody who was pushed into a hard family dynamic where she had to take her entire family from Scotland all the way to Iceland just to make sure that they survived in a very chaotic era. And the journey that she went on to basically assign her grandchildren with different families so their dynasty could continue, and then she settled in Iceland. That is a great journey of just how Norse women had to find a way to actually survive outside of battle, really. There's another interesting character called Astrid Ola's daughter, who was a queen who basically tried to stop a war between two different kingdoms. And as the legend goes about her life, she had to take fate into her own hands and actually present herself to a king called Olaf and actually be that bridge between two worlds. And again, that was not her fighting. That was her just being politically savvy enough to make the decision that her father or her wider family couldn't make without her, essentially.
Yeah, and again, it's the idea that people might think of it's all sort of long hauls and axes through the head, etc. I mean, there are some wonderful archaeological finds, aren't there? I mean, there's the intricacy of the work. You know, some of the statues or the sort of the runes and the tokens that are found in Viking lands are quite exquisite, aren't they? And that shows the depth of the culture.
Yeah, rune's fascinating as well. I obviously can't see me, but myself, I'm like covered in Norse tattoos and runes because I really like that from like the point of view of like they really covered themselves in these runes because it might have meant strength, it might have meant courage or bravery. And I think that's something that we can definitely take forward into our lives about particular symbols that are timeless throughout different cultures.
And the actual sort of, when you come to put this together, I mean, did you spend sort of days going through because the sagas aren't small, are they? I mean, they are huge and can be quite ponderous. So how do you sort of boil this down to a readable version that makes people want to zip through it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And to be honest, I did do a lot of research into going back to the original sagas and actually trying to say, like, yeah, this is written in a very certain way that might not actually translate well into a modern audience. So I thought, like, how could I really distill this down? And that actually meant that I'd read the original saga and then I'd actually read like a modern retelling side by side with it as well to see like the difference. And by looking at it in my writing style, I suppose that helped me translate what I think was probably the most applicable lesson to whoever might be reading it. I mean, I did it with the Volsung saga. There's another saga called the Saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, who was like a warrior poet, and his story is fascinating. But there's a lot of archaic old language that you might think of, like in The Lord of the Rings, for example. So that's great for some readers, but for my audience, particularly with the book, I just wanted to make it as accessible as possible to a layman who might be either just looking at Vikings in a very casual way, or people who might even have a deeper interest with it too. I still wanted them to consume it with that archaeological perspective, but also with that easy storytelling-led approach as well.
Yeah, indeed. I find Hardrada fascinating because, you know, obviously when we're taught at school, we're taught 1066 is the Norman invasion, and it's Harold getting shot with, through the eye, etc. And they tend to brush over the Battle of Stamford Bridge, don't they, in the north, and that army, and it's Hardrada is killed in that battle, and it's if you like the last show of the dice of a great Viking warrior king. But British history just tends to keep him almost as a side or a warm up act for what's going to happen in on the south coast.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hardrada for me is definitely one of those. Is definitely one of my favourite Viking figures of all time, and I just really think it's a misnomer to label him as the last Viking, because again we're looking at it in this Anglo-centric point of view. And an interesting fact is, when I mentioned Sigurd the Crusader, he actually comes from Harald Hardrada's bloodline. So he was Hardrada's great grandson, and Sigurd's father, Strife-Lover, he was another member of the Hardrada lifeline. And what I think is interesting as well is if you want to take it as a historical fact, Hardrada, yes, died on English soil, but then Strife-Lover in this family, he died in Ireland, so he also got put with the moniker of the last Viking because he died abroad, technically in Ireland. So again, one moniker just does not mean like the end of an era. I would say in that perspective in the book that Ryder was like the last of a dying breed, in the sense that, yes, he embodied all of the traditional aspects of like a Norse hero who had the cleverness of Odin and the strength of Thor, but his bloodline carried on for like hundreds of years. And then we see the next turning of Viking history, if you want to put like the next chapter on it, which basically is it all becomes more inward facing. The kings fought amongst themselves to like carve up Norway and the rest of Scandinavia, and it became more about religious sort of missions rather than raiding for the point of just fulfilling mercenary ambitions.
It really is fascinating. I mean, the Vikings in Ireland, again, I mean, that is a whole subject in itself. And then you have the kings of Ireland trying to unite and throw out, and by which time they've intermingled with obviously the Irish people there. You know, some have got alliances. And I think, where was it? I think it was Darlington I went to, up on the, you know, if you go up on the northeast coast of the UK, you know, as the PR for Darlington once told me at one point, that's why we have so many attractive blonde women up here, because of the bloodlines intermingling.
Oh yeah, I could believe that. Yeah, yeah. But no, it's interesting you mentioned the Irish Vikings as well, and you've got another figure like Ivar the Boneless, the son of Ragnar. Again, he's an interesting character. Another legend about his life.
He's got no thigh bone, has he? He gets carried around in a chair, isn't he?
Yeah, that's one sort of version of it. Either he had no bones at all, or he was so like fluid with his bones that people thought he was boneless in battle. But I suppose that actually raises an interesting point of view about like what the Norse might have thought of, you know, what we would classify as disabled in this day and age. And I wanted to make that quite clear in the book as well, and be like trying to explore these other things, because that is one of the sort of biggest points about Ivar's legend, for example. If he was like physically disabled, would like what's the best way to say this? Would like a very outward facing conquering nation like the Norse want to actually follow somebody who would be physically enabled to lead them into battle? But you would think that in that sense that because Ivar was from like a wealthy family, then historically perhaps he could have been in that focus, even if he didn't have all of the physical tools to do so. And to me, that raises interest in like the Norse spirituality side as well. There's two things that I think of that are interesting in the Norse mindset, called the Hamar and the Huga. The Hamar in the Norse mindset was called the body, which is like the shape of somebody that could change or go through different states. So you might think of a berserker, for example. Their state of mind would have changed in battle, so that's going to their shape changing with the hammer. But then you have the Huga, which is the closest thing in the Norse that we would label as the spirit or the soul. And I like to believe that particularly in this era, that the soul was the most important thing that the Vikings would have looked at, rather than the actual shape of the body. The deeds would have mattered. The mindset of going bravely into whatever they were facing was more important than the physical shell, as it were.
And it also goes to show that it's an advanced civilization. It's not brutal. It's not sort of the Mongols or the you know, the Huns. It is actually a civilization that judges somebody by their worth, being able to plan a battle, rather than just saying, you know, rather than say that the myth of Sparta, where anybody who isn't as able as the rest of them is left to die in the wilderness. And that shows advanced civilization as the Vikings were.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's infinitely fascinating to me. Again, what was really fascinating in the research for me as well is to add to those other 2 points about the Hamar and the Huga. There was also this thing called the luck spirit, where we've got this expression, one's luck literally runs out. I do believe that started with the Vikings, where they thought they had an actual spirit inside them, where if that physically left them, then their whole luck would have run out, and then they would have been dishonored in battle to an extent. And then what I think is really interesting as well is that another part of that wider Norse mind was the fact that they had a female spirit inside of them. And I think that really flips like this idea of the hyper-masculine Viking image on its head, to say, oh, you might have like a sliver of a woman inside you every time you go into battle. And again, that's like a love breaking stereotypes like that, just to assume that because something you see in the media, there is just so much more going on if you really dig into the historical fact of these things.
Fascinating indeed. What are you hoping that people will take from Norse fighting heroes, Jamie?
There's a few things. I would like first to, as we've discussed, like the Vikings were more than just the stereotypes that they see on TV and in pop culture. There's much more beneath the surface. Secondly, I'd like to see if people can take away like practical lessons for their own lives, because in each chapter I do summarize the story of each of these heroes and the lessons that might be applicable in business or personal life, so people can learn as they do. And also that we're all on our own journey as well, because the Vikings were a multicultural cast of characters, and as we're all on our own journey as well, we can take historical lessons away and apply them to our own philosophies as we evolve and grow as people too.
The book is called Norse Fighting Heroes, Kings, Conquerors and Shieldmaidens. It's by Jamie Ryder. Jamie, if people want to find you online, where's the best place to find you online?
Yeah, you can go to jamieryderbooks.com.
And you can also order the book via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called Norse Fighting Heroes. It's by Jamie Ryder. Jamie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles. Fascinating conversation, and I wish you all the best.